Andrew Wheeler, who continued environmental rollbacks, is confirmed to lead E.P.A. The New York Times. Washington U. The Senate on Thursday confirmed Andrew R. Wheeler to be the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, giving oversight of the nation's air and water to a former coal lobbyist and seasoned Washington insider. The confirmation formalized a role Mr. Wheeler has held in an acting capacity since the summer when President Trump's first administrator, Scott Pruitt. The vote, 52-47, went mostly along party lines and underscored partisan divisions over the Trump administration's continued commitment to repealing environmental regulations under Mr. Wheeler. Senator Susan Collins of Maine was the only Republican to vote against Mr. Wheeler. The policies he has supported as acting administrator are not in the best interest of our environment and public health, particularly given the threat of climate change to our nation, Senator Collins said. Nearly 8 months after taking over the chief role from Mr. Pruitt, who was known for his combative style, analysts said Mr. Wheeler had brought a change in demeanor to the agency but virtually no difference in policy direction from his predecessor. Want climate news in your inbox? Our email newsletter. Jonathan H. Adler, a professor at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, characterized Mr. Wheeler's soft-spoken style and willingness to listen to criticism as genuine. But, he said, this is an administration that would like to reduce the overall regulatory footprint of the federal government, Mr. Adler said. Republicans said they have been delighted to discover Mr. Wheeler is as enthusiastic about and promoting coal as Mr. Pruitt was, and are looking to him to cement Mr. Trump's legacy as a warrior against what they see as regulatory overreach. He's been a very solid follow-on to Scott Pruitt, said Michael McKenna, a Republican energy lobbyist. He's followed through. Mr. Wheeler has moved to dramatically weaken two of former President Obama's signature climate change initiatives, cutting and from, while also proposing to make easier to approve. He has also sought to unwind the legal justification for curbing toxic, and dismissed A. Some of the most consequential climate rollbacks are expected to be finalized in the coming months. That will most likely. Mary D. Nichols, who leads California's Air Quality Agency, said she had experienced firsthand the dissonance between Mr. Wheeler's demeanor and his actions. By spring of 2018, relations between the state and the Trump administration had hit a low point amid a feud over California's right to set automobile emissions standards stricter than the ones set by the federal government. Mr. Pruitt had, about a week after Mr. Pruitt's resignation, when Mr. Wheeler called her office at the California Air Resources Board, Ms. Nichols said she was encouraged. He wanted to make sure I knew he was going to be more open and accessible than his predecessor was, Ms. Nichols said. Nevertheless, everyone was polite. That was a welcomed change, she said. But there was no difference. The White House announced last week that the E.P.A. and the Department of Transportation had over its clean air waiver. The move signaled that, I have to say that I don't find him materially different than Scott Pruitt in his policies or the mission that he has taken on, Ms. Nichols said. The only difference, on climate change, Mr. Wheeler also has taken a calibrated tone that contrasts with his policies. Unlike Mr. Pruitt, who went on television to say Mr. Wheeler told a Senate confirmation panel in January that he rated his level, but, 2 weeks later, he appointed John Christie, an atmospheric scientist at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who has testified that the Earth will benefit from more planet-warming emissions, to an influential E.P.A. scientific advisory board. And asked whether he intended to work with Congress to finalize a ban on chlorpyrifos, an insecticide associated with developmental delays and cognitive impairments in children that Mr. Pruitt, of the, chose not to remove from use. Mr. Wheeler assured lawmakers in a written statement that the agency was committed to fully evaluating this pesticide using the best available science. Yet the agency under Mr. Wheeler's leadership had already challenged a decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ordering the E.P.A. to ban the pesticide. This month, the E.P.A. officials did not respond to a request for comment on this article. Mr. Adler said that Mr. Wheeler's experience in Washington has helped him avoid waving red flags in front of lawmakers. But ultimately, there is a tendency to assume if someone is reasonable they're going to agree with you, Mr. Adler said. Wheeler has a very... Emily Cochran contributed reporting. For more news on climate and the environment.
Raindrops, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park, pot.